Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Taman.
And welcome back to Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders. That's me. And the other guy is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as the Captain of the Enterprise.
We are intellectual property lawyers and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders. You can find Kirk at KirkDMN. We are here today to do one of our fluff episodes, sort of. We're going to talk about The Bad Batch Season 3. Actually, this morning, Kirk, I was driving into the office and I was listening to a podcast. It's normally about Iowa sports, but they did, you'll love this. They did an episode about country music. I do not like country music. Kirk does, but I listened to this episode. I was just curious. At the beginning, the host says, someone raises the question, you do a sports podcast, why are you talking about country music? And the guy said, because when you do something in creative, you eventually get tired of talking about the same thing over and over again. It kind of occurred to me, that's one of the reasons why we like to talk about not just like the law of these geek culture, geek properties, but the properties themselves. It's just fun to get a break from the law and talk about something else once in a while.
Well, we talk about the law all day, every day for the most part, so...
So, Bad Batch Season 3, I don't know that we did a full review of Seasons 1 or 2. I think you did.
We did Season 1, at least.
An Edamame episode. So, if you haven't seen what this is, it is based on a team of, how would you describe it, rogue clones? Like
they're bad. They're the Bad Batch. They're rogue clones, but they're miscloned clones, might be the best way to describe it. And they do originally appear in Clone Wars. They have, I think, 2 episodes in Clone Wars, something like that.
As I recall, you weren't a real fan of, I haven't seen those episodes, but you were not a big fan of them in Clone Wars.
No, I was not a big fan of them in Clone Wars at all. I thought they were kind of, to me, it had too much of the feel of we need to have clones that aren't clones.
Yeah.
And let's come up with some interesting characters so we can give them human. It's sort of the same way as it's the best episodes of Star Trek are the ones when Spock isn't behaving like a Vulcan or Data isn't behaving like an android because the actors get bored. I kind of get the impression that, this was, the animators are bored with animating the same clones. Let's make new clones.
And conceptually, they're kind of like the A-Team. So you've got...
Yeah, it's a good way to describe them, actually.
You've got Wrecker, who's the muscle.
Yeah.
You've got Tech, who's the tech guy. He's Q, right? You've got Hunter, I think, is the main leader guy. You've got Echo, who's kind of the spy infiltrator. And then Crosshair is your assassin / sniper.
Yeah.
And that's how they're originally introduced. In Season 1, they set up that they escape from, they kind of separate from the Empire.
Escape from Camino.
Escape from Camino.
And the idea is you really have it starts right at Order 66.
Yes.
So you basically have the idea that they're kind of, and it doesn't affect them. And so they're kind of trying to help with their Jedi escape. You kind of see the opposite sides of the stuff you saw in Order 66. But they end up, they're on Camino. You find out sort of what's going on in Camino, what's going on with them.
They escape Camino. They go into hiding. They're trying to avoid the Empire. Eventually, they circle back to Camino.
Well, then they pick up Omega.
Omega is another clone.
You don't know that right away.
Yeah, supposedly from the same basic line of clones.
Yeah, it's a young girl.
Yeah, young girl. So you got the father-daughter thing. That's very common in these kind of things these days.
Yeah, and she works for, as you were saying, Namaste. Who's sort of
Nalase. We keep saying Namaste, like Hare Krishna's here. Who's sort of is one of definitely the most senior cloners on Camino. I don't think she really runs the facility, but she's definitely a sort of very senior. Like on the science side, she seems to be the most knowledgeable. Yeah. And so you have sort of the whole play about that. You have them return to Camino, the whole thing sort of behind it there. The Empire destroys the cloning base at the end of Season 1, and that's a very tragic scene. Yeah, it actually it did hit me. I didn't think it was going to. Yeah, and it's very interesting because I think I said it in my review of it originally. I kind of saw Camino as kind of an annoyance in the prequels. Yeah, it wasn't like a compelling part of the plot, but when they destroyed it, you really felt like, okay, that's the end of the Old Republic and the start of the Empire. Yeah, and it had this feel of the idea of oppression of the Empire. And I'm going to get into that. The one thing I really love about this show, and it's a lot of what we've seen in a lot of the shows recently, coming from sort of the Disney Plus, some of the animation, some of the live actions, is this concept of the Empire being very oppressive and just they're doing whatever they want
regardless of what anybody feels about it.
And you see it being added step by step. So in the first season, I think we did talk about this, but like in the first season, they start adding like flight codes you have to transfer from planet to planet, and that's sort of almost a reference to like communism codes, and like earthly dictatorships, where the first way you control a population is limit travel, limit what they can do, make them utterly dependent on getting the government's permission to do things. And you see the empire starting to crack down and do that.
And really the idea also of you start seeing things like secret police. You know, the concept of the stormtroopers start to sort of show up. They become more and more pervasive. You get the idea of them being a little more faceless. I mean, it's what I really love about what's happened with a lot of the properties recently is they've done this really great job of taking the Empire, of just being, you know, the classic cowboy in the black hat, which it really was when George Lucas wrote it. I mean, it's a Western, that's what he is. You know, that's what Vader is. To being, they're so oppressive, it tends to bump into the idea of what we think of as being sort of outright evil. Now you have the Sith and you have sort of the Emperor and stuff like that. But even they sort of limited in some respects that to the Emperor. They've even kind of given Vader a bit of a pass in that. And that's the thing I think that, you know, has been really good about this is you're really getting this feel of like, it's this just incredibly oppressive engine that people are just being ground up in.
Yes.
There's nothing you can do about this.
Well, and the promise that the Empire brings to its member systems is you've been living in chaos. I mean, we always say freedom is messy. Freedom is sloppy. So the Empire says, okay, we'll do away with this nettlesome freedom thing, but we will bring order. And it says even in the original trilogy,
safety,
bring order and safety to the galaxy. So Bad Batch Season 2, I think the center theme there is the transition from the clone army to human conscripted stormtroopers. And then in connection with that, the clones who are left over had to find a place in this new world where they have no function, right? They're not trained to do anything else.
You also have the concept behind this, and we didn't talk about, is that basically you find out Order 66 was done using microchips that controlled the clones. The Bad Batches didn't work, or they didn't have them, and it doesn't work, except it does work on Hunter. They're starting out on Hunter on Crosshair. And
or so we think.
Or so we think, but he also ends up essentially joining the Empire.
Yeah, to help hunt down the rest of the Bad Batch.
The Bad Batch and the Jedi and everything else. And so that kind of becomes also a central theme of the idea of how to be a Crosshair back. The big thing I really see behind this is, and I like your analogy to being the A-Team, we see the A-Team go from being, you know, Vietnam warriors, which is sort of what they are before the start of the A-Team, to being the A-Team. They become mercenaries.
Yeah.
They play into the idea these guys are operating outside the law. You know, they work it out of the back of a bar. I mean, you know, you also start getting a little bit more of the idea that, like, Omega's important.
Yes.
And you're not entirely sure why.
We start to get that in the middle of Season 2, that she has some special relevance. We don't know why she was created.
Yeah.
But we do get the sense that she's different from the rest. And by the end of Season 2, she's captured by this Dr. Hemlock, taken to some new cloning facility with Nala Se. We don't know why, but we assume it's for nefarious purposes. And she is separated from the rest of the Bad Batch. Crosshair is also separated, but we also find out that he is being abused by the Empire, and he's starting to be disillusioned about his role with them.
Yeah, he has one very sort of important episode where basically you find out, you know, sort of just because he's a clone, he's essentially disrespected.
Yeah, he's looked down upon as they're transitioning to human conscripts.
Yeah, and he's really, I mean, he's actively abused by his commanding officer, and because his commanding officer really sees clothes as sort of subhuman.
Yeah.
And in the end, they have a showdown. He ends up killing his commanding officer, and that ends up getting him arrested and in trouble.
And sent to the same
facility that you know,
Omega goes to. So thus opens Season 3, which is the last season of the series. I'm guessing a lot of you have seen it. If not, I guess there was a whole bunch of spoilers right there, but we're going to spoil the rest of Season 3 too. So don't listen if you don't want to have it spoiled. So Season 3, again, we'll assume you've seen it. Kirk and I have talked about this quite a bit. It's a peculiar season because most of the episodes, in my view at least, don't have a whole lot of character. Well, some character development, not a lot of plot advancement. The episodes kind of introduce a plot point, usually some MacGuffin, which may be like an actual MacGuffin or a piece of information that they need to get. And then in between that first 5 minutes where they introduce that MacGuffin and the last 5 minutes where they get there is a bunch of usually very well choreographed action that's fun, it's exciting, but ultimately in service of nothing because what happens during the action doesn't really affect the rest of the plot in any meaningful way.
One thing we did forget to mention, by the way, end of Season 2, Tech dies. Supposedly he falls to what's presumed his death. But we don't actually see him die, we just see him fall.
And you and I didn't believe it.
No, we didn't believe it.
Star Wars, nobody's ever really dead.
It really felt like season 2 was a bit tacked on to season 1.
Yeah.
You'd had Tech's death, Omega's captured and separated. We kind of need to resolve a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
The earlier episodes in season 3 are the best episodes.
Yeah, so the first episode is probably the most unusual. Nothing happens in the episode.
Literally nothing happens.
It's just a whole bunch of scene setting, mood setting, character development, introducing Emery, who is another clone like Omega. She's called like her sister, but we don't think she's got the same special sauce that Omega has, which at the beginning we don't know what that is yet. And now Asay is there, and Dr. Hemlock, who's like the cloning master guy, is there. And he was introduced in the season 2 at some point.
He was introduced in season 2.
Yeah. So that's all. That scene's all kind of set, and Crosshair is there, and Omega reunites with Crosshair, so we kind of get like an update on where everybody's at. We never see in that episode the rest of the Bad Batch. We don't know what they're doing or where they are, but presumably they're trying to get in touch with her and break her free, but they don't know where she is.
It's kind of the way I kind of put it is it's a day in the life of Omega is kind of the way they do this thing with it, and Omega lives an incredibly regimented life because she's in prison.
Yeah, and they're doing these weird blood tests, and like even as the audience, you don't really know what it's about yet.
Yeah, so that I actually really enjoyed the episode,
yeah.
And part of the reason I enjoyed the episode is because it's in some sense difficult to watch. It's dull. It's, but
I wasn't bored.
We weren't bored.
Yeah.
But you really get the idea of like, this life is miserable.
Yeah.
You
it's very effective that way. It conveys sort of the drudgery and dreariness of her day-to-day life, while also very effectively doling out a lot of information that we as the audience need to understand what's going on. And unlike most of the rest of the episodes, doing it without a bunch of wall-to-wall action
there's missing
sequence.
No action in this.
Yeah, so it's really curious that's how they chose to open. I just told Kirk before we sat down, for a show like this, I would expect to open with just blistering action to draw you in right away and get you engaged. And they really went the opposite direction, and I thought it was really effective.
Yeah, I also agree. I think it was really effective. I enjoyed the episode. It's one of my favorite episodes of the series and the season, I think, without any question. And again, part of it's because I really like that Empire is oppressive feel. The concept behind it and the way they do it, I just think really, really works.
Then you get the second episode, which is kind of the opposite of the first one. It's almost nothing but action, and it's the first episode in the series, not in the series, at least the season, with a pattern that will be repeated, so at the beginning we meet the Bad Batch. Not meet them, we've met them before, but we get reoriented on where they're at. They're trying to find Omega. They know she's been taken to this cloning facility. They don't know where it is, but somebody has told them where they might find a clue of where it is in some computer somewhere, so they have to break in and get this clue. Yeah. And then in the last 30 seconds, they break in and get the clue, and then but it's not actually the location, it's some other information. It's the next MacGuffin they have to track down. Like if this was an MMORPG, it'd be phase 2 of a 19-phase quest.
Catch 19 more fish.
Exactly. But in between those two is a whole bunch of action, all really well done, but all of it involves just action for action's sake. None of the skills that they use, none of the moves that they use, the techniques they use, none of the information we get as the audience is ever used again anywhere in the rest of the season that I recall.
Yeah.
They fight some weird monster on this planet, which if they went back to that planet, they might learn something that they would use later, like to lure somebody else into that monster's trap. That doesn't really happen. Likewise, when Omega breaks out of Tantus, which she of course does at some point,
with Crosshair.
Yeah, with Crosshair. They fight their way out through the wild animals that surround the base. And I expected that later, when the Bad Batch is trying to break back in, the knowledge they had of how these animals worked, they would use to trick the Empire. You can see where this is going.
Yeah.
But they don't really do that. So this series where it fell down to me, and this is a real nitpick from a writing perspective, was there's a lot of stuff that they set up and never paid off.
Yeah.
Which is just kind of a waste of screen time. This is a 15 or 16 episode series. They could have gotten all the plot done in an hour and a half.
Yeah, basically, and that's the other thing. The way I always put it, as I said, to me, episode 2 is episode 1 from the rest of the Bad Batch, which kind of fits because Omega's life is this incredibly regimented, boring life,
and their life is
their life their life. The best way to potentially put it is the classic YouTube video. Video game playthrough. It's lots of screaming and action.
Yes.
And it's kind of interesting to see the dichotomy, but I kind of like the way they did that as a dichotomy. And in the end, neither one of the plots goes anywhere. You just have this sort of thing with it. So that's sort of where we start, with it. you then basically have, and I mean, as we start getting into the middle of the episodes, I don't think we're going to go episode by episode.
No.
But effectively, we have Omega, Crosshair, and the Bad Batch get back together.
Yes. She escapes. They hook back up and reconnect. It doesn't take that long.
No.
And the main addition is they add Batcher, who's this little dog-like creature they free.
Yep.
And again, we learn a lot about Batcher. He seems really important, but then never really plays any important role in the rest of the story. Like, he affects the plot here and there, but I kind of thought that he would be like the key to something at some point. It's just, no, we just added this character.
You also get that these blood tests, they've been doing these blood tests on all the clones, and somehow Omega's is different.
Yeah.
And it involves this thing called Project Necromancer.
Which we don't know what it is.
Which you don't know what it is, but, you know, my take...
We can make reasonable
my
inferences.
take from it is what it is. We are trying to raise somebody from the dead, Necromancer. And more than likely what it has to do with, and my take has always been, this is the cloning of the Emperor that we're going to encounter in episode 9 of the movies. This is setting that up. That's because it's cloning tech. You know, it's the Emperor's most important project, and they won't show you what's in the tank.
Yeah.
And so that's my immediate take is, okay, that's what this is. So somehow Omega is important to the cloning of the Emperor. Okay.
Well, they're taking M count, which they don't tell you what it is, but we assume it's midichlorians.
Midichlorians. And so you really get the idea that somehow this is incredibly important to the Emperor, and that she's somehow incredibly important to this plot. So they need to recapture her, and that sets up the, hey, we need to go, you know, have this chase where we're going to try and chase her down. So I think that you also have an episode in it where you kind of come to a reckoning with Crosshair's past.
Yes. And we find out Crosshair was in some kind of experimentation where his shooting, his stabling hand for his gun, he's getting like a tremor.
A tremor in it. And that, you know, some kind of thing that he went through that he basically failed, sort of they imply, but it was to train other people. We also get the idea that they have these assassins, and we know that those are related to his training because he's afraid of one of them in particular. And we then start to speculate during the course of this that assassin is Tech.
Yeah. Because they're very careful to never take his mask off. And even when you think he's been defeated, and you're like, oh, well, because there's just one more faceless, nameless villain that's been defeated, they make sure you know that he's not. Like, they throw him down a waterfall, and he crawls out at the very end of the episode.
Yeah.
At that point, it's like, okay, well, it's definitely Tech, and he's been turned somehow against them. Maybe he's being controlled by a chip, kind of like the clones were. They reinserted the chips, maybe. But no, that's not what happens.
That's not what happens. But we have that sort of, you know, whole thing with it. I have to admit, the one episode where we end up back on the planet that Crosshair had his encounter with the Empire, they go to the planet to go get stuff from it. Sort of this reckoning with his past is, I think, potentially the best episode of the season. What I liked about it was the fact that it really did reference lots of stuff from that episode that they sort of recognized was, this is who Crosshair is now. This is an important aspect
of it. Was that the snow planet with like the subterranean creature that kept,
they kept harassing them.
Like the sandworm, it's a sandworm.
It's a sandworm, and sort of that kind of thing with it. And you have that this, again, major reckoning. What does he know about the knowledge? And even just the fact that, like, everybody he knows associated with this is dead. You know, he's picking up the clone helmets of the people associated with it. He's lost. And that's really the best way I sort of put this is, what you get from this is just how lost Crosshair is. He had the idea of being, I'm a soldier of the Empire. He kind of clung to that of, I'm a good soldier and that's what I'm supposed to be.
That's what we're supposed to do. And chip or no chip.
Yeah, chip or no chip. And then the whole thing sort of falls apart but the Empire doesn't want me. And now you have he goes back to where he realized that Empire doesn't want me, and he realizes that doesn't really exist anymore. And he's out of space and time. And they play off that with this palsy that he has, with his hands. And you start to wonder, is this nerves? Like, what is this? Is this something with the experimentation, or is this literally that he's losing it, and it's because of both of these things sort of in combination. So I really like that. We continue to advance a little bit from there, and
they weave in a lot of like side characters we've seen before. The assassin from The Mandalorian is there for an episode. They bring back, who's the other person they bring back? There was a couple different people the pirate lady.
The pirate,
she comes back, so it was kind of fun to see them all. But again, none of these episodes really, move the plot forward a whole lot.
We have a reformed Inquisitor too, don't we?
Yes, and they go to the one, Crosshair and Omega wind up on a planet where she has to win a game of cards against an Imperial officer to afford to buy transportation back off the planet. Which again, I thought that officer might show back up at some point later in the series and play some role in the plot. Doesn't really happen. So just a lot of neat concepts that are set up, opportunities that are introduced to really weave together a good, complicated, interesting story, and they just kind of didn't do anything with any of it.
I think the hardest part with it is, and again, you can even tell from us discussing this, all these episodes are forgettable, and it's kind of hard to keep the plot line in order. Yeah. What happened when, who happened where.
Well, and ultimately, at the last episode, it's the same place the first one was. Like, the last episode, she's back in prison in Tantus trying to get out, and the rest of the Bad Batch is trying to get to her. So we kind of haven't really gone anywhere after 13 episodes of the series.
And we have a real key part in that, which is Crosshair missing the shot to put the tracker on her because of the palsy.
Yes.
That being a sort of key aspect of this, if he's monstrously affected by this. And so that's, again, I think you've had a few interesting cameos. You had some kind of follow-up of like what's happened to people. Again, I'm pretty positive one of the characters was an Inquisitor in Clone Wars. Yeah. And I'm literally forgetting who it's Ventress.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And so each episode is individually enjoyable. But there's no real plot there. And as you said, there's all these sort of plot hooks that don't get used.
They bring Rex back. They bring Hauser back for a couple episodes. They're there with Echo, and they do some action-y things. And then they all leave. And then nothing's really changed in terms of like where everybody stands.
And basically what we're after is these MacGuffins. We're trying to figure out where this planet is.
They free Rampart, so he's part of it for a while. But then he doesn't really do anything either. It could have been anybody. Like, the whole episode to free Rampart, again, lots of good action, but They need Rampart to get information. They go to the planet where he's in prison. They break him out. So after 45 minutes, all that's changed is we now have Rampart. But they haven't really learned anything or done anything.
You learn that Rampart doesn't really know where the planet is. He only knows how to get there.
And we were comparing that. It's not that action for action's sake is bad necessarily, but you can do a lot more with a good action sequence. And you and I were talking about this the other day, comparing this with the opening sequence to episode 4, which is a action sequence. Multiple action sequences. We have a space battle sequence between the the Star Destroyer and Leia's ship.
It's Tantive
4. And then we have a firefight inside the ship where nobody says anything. And then Vader walks in. And we were talking about how, like, the way it's shot, it conveys information to us, right? We see how badly outgunned Leia is. Her ship goes by. It looks impressive until you see the Star Destroyer. And then you realize, like, how small it is. You see, like, the overhead shot of the Star Destroyer kind of implies the Empire's, dominant position and how all-encompassing they are. They easily disable the ship. And then, even with Vader, they have all these lackeys come in, right? The stormtroopers come in, they take all the bullets. Even though Vader could easily stop them all, he's still not going to put himself at risk. Then he comes in only after the firefighting is done to start asking questions and killing.
You also get kind of the immediate adherence to him by the stormtroopers. Yes. There's a scene which I always thought is interesting. One of the stormtroopers is kind of picking up a body.
And he stands up really quickly.
Stands up very quickly and kind of stands at attention as
all
Vader walks
real
in.
subtle character development stuff. The soundtrack we learn about Vader, the breathing, the way he looks around, the way he lifts people up. I mean, there's no dialogue. There's no explanation of what's going on. It's all just plot information conveyed visually. And we're talking about cinema. We're talking about a visual narrative. The action sequences here, I mean, if it's there, it's too subtle. I didn't pick up on it, but I didn't catch any of that kind of stuff. It was just, we need to have action because action's interesting, and it's kind of the way you compensate for a plot that doesn't have a lot to do.
And I think there's a lot of subtle points, but it's all references to other things.
Yeah.
And that's, if I have one thing that I took away from this season, to me, this season felt like it was supposed to be hooks. It was supposed to be either let's close hooks, let's open hooks.
Setting up new things? Yeah. Crosshair's Tremor is a good example. That stuck with you and me because it's one of the few times that the action sequences conveyed character information. That's how we learn that he has this tremor, and it affects the plot. He has the tremor, he misses the shot for the tracker, so they have to find a different way to find out where Tantus is. So that's a good way you can use an action sequence to characterize and advance the plot. Just, for every one incident like that, there's another hour of action that, again, it's not like it was boring action. It was good.
Every one of these episodes is good. They just don't seem to have... You kind of get to the end of it and you're like, wait, nothing happened.
Yeah, like I watched it, nothing happened. And like first season of The Mandalorian had a little bit of this too, where lots of good action. And it was... Maybe one of the reasons this doesn't feel as exciting as that did is we now have 3 seasons of The Mandalorian doing a lot of that kind of thing. And now we're in the 3rd season of The Bad Batch. We've seen a lot of this content from Filoni that's kind of made in this way. And again, it's not like it's not interesting or exciting. It's just that it could do so much more, and it's not.
Yeah, and it feels like he is. He's putting Easter... It feels in some respects like Lost, where everything, if you ever watched Lost... it feels like everything's important because they keep referring back to things. Things are important, the plane that we got this thing from turns out to be important because it's related to one of the characters. Oh, okay. Like those kind of things sort of, with it has that feel of everything's important, but particularly in the third season, you either have lots of hooks are opened that aren't closed, and the closure all comes from hooks you didn't realize were still open.
Yeah.
You didn't really think about. And I think the best one is when we then get to the near the end, we're now having the battle to get Omega out. You have learned that Omega is indeed necessary to protege Necromancer, and they figured it out. Hemlock has now figured it out.
Yeah. Well, because we had Nala Se and I think was it Emery too? They were kind of hiding her test results from Hemlock.
Well, it's originally Nala Se is doing it. Yeah. She gets caught.
And imprisoned.
And then Nala Se starts, replacing her and doing it, and the more Nala Se learns about it.
Emery.
The more Emery learns about it, the more she doesn't like this because it definitely involves capture of young Jedi.
Yeah, they're capturing young kids and doing experiments on them.
And they're all clearly Jedi. That's the only thing you get. They're Force sensitive. I shouldn't say they're not Jedi. And that's you get the suppression of the Empire, and that sort of stuff now fall on Emery of kind of this. This is a whole lot worse than I ever thought it was. I thought I was doing science for the good of the army, and it turns out, no, I'm involved in this secret project, which is basically for, tormenting children. And you kind of get it has some elements to me of...
It's kind of a dark plot, if you think about it.
Learning about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. I mean, it's kind of like that kind of piece of it, of the idea that there's this whole secret project ongoing that most people don't know about, which is horrible. And the standard sort of soldier doesn't know that's going on and doesn't really realize that they're supporting it. And that's kind of I think the journey Emery goes through is she becomes, involved with it in the most dramatic way possible because she ends up taking it over, sort of unintentionally. And you really see there's a lot of shots that they do with her where you just see her facial expression or something like that in reaction to something. And you're like, she's not okay with this.
Yeah.
That's the thing here, even though she was clearly okay with this at the start.
But the more she learned, the more uncomfortable she got, which is a kind of, she's one of the few characters that had a real arc. Most of the Bad Batch themselves didn't really have much of a story arc. Crosshair definitely did. But, Wrecker's pretty easy. He's the big muscle-headed strong man. There's not much to advance there. In fact, if he changed, I'd be disappointed.
Yeah.
Hunter, maybe a little bit. You get some sense that he feels like he's failed some ways in leading the team. And certainly, I think at some point, somebody goes after him on that ground. I think towards the end, one of the other characters is like, you failed, Hunter. But, he's overburdened.
It's Crosshair, actually.
Is it really? Yeah. But Echo is kind of only half in the plot. Tech's gone, so there's not a whole lot of character development to do for the main characters themselves. Yeah. Omega maybe has the most because she kind of grows up a lot over the course of this season and becomes a lot more independent.
Yeah, she really grows up. You get the impression that because of this, she's been thrust into the situation of being incredibly important to something she does not want to be important to. She has to grow up and she's the bait, and she knows it.
Yeah.
And she doesn't want to be the bait, but she has to be the bait. And in some sense, I think that's where they play around with her doll. She has the whole thing with her doll, which has always been very important. And by the end, she's giving it away to other people to help them, sort of the kids cope and stuff like that. The thing I think is that one of the things I thought was interesting about the sort of battle to get her back is you have her trying to escape, while simultaneously the Bad Batch is trying to get in to rescue her. So you literally have two things that can easily bypass each other. But the one thing I thought was interesting behind it is talking about the idea of closing hooks. The Zilla Beast, which suddenly shows up.
I completely had forgotten about that thing.
Yeah. Which is from
episode season 2 somewhere?
It's somewhere early in Clone Wars. Then it shows up again later in Clone Wars. And it's sent off to a scientific facility because they're trying to do stuff with it. I've wondered if Hemlock's from there, and I just didn't catch him as being an intro. But it's like, wait a minute, why is the Zillo Beast here? And we're gonna free the Zillo Beast. And again, there was no reason for the Zillo Beast to need to be there. There was no reason for them to, have an issue of we need to free it and we kind of watch it running off into the woods and stuff like that. Other than, it was kind of something left hanging that the Empire had. Let's close that plot line. And again, that's where, to me, that was the epitome of this. We're using Bad Batch to close plot lines and other things, primarily Clone Wars. And again, Ventress being one of those, sort of aspects, as to what it is. you have all of these things kind of getting closed, while at the same time we're opening all these questions of like, who are these new people? Who are these Jedi kids? Who are they, that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, new things coming. Who is Emery? Who is Hemlock?
Because we wondered if Hemlock would wind up being the same guy as the Doctor that's in The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
But Hemlock clearly dies at the end.
Yeah, so we have to assume Hemlock's clearly dead at the end. I mean, it is Star Wars. Anybody can come back.
Well, the Doctor's, and I forget his name, but the one in The Mandalorian has a different name. He's not nearly old enough to still be Hemlock after all that time. So I think we can assume it's not the same guy.
Yeah.
But what that in turn implies, because at the end of this series... is it Tarkin that shows up and says we're going to close this project down?
Yes, it's Tarkin.
Yeah, so Tarkin shows up and he's like, we're done with this cloning nonsense. We're going to redivert all these resources to Project Stardust. That's the Death Star. And so, in theory, Project Necromancer, or whatever it was for, is gone. Yep. So then you and I have hypothesized, maybe on the podcast, maybe not, I don't remember, that, we just talked about it. We think this might really be for cloning the Emperor for Episode 9. And then is that also what the Doctor and the Mandalorian is doing with Baby Yoda, is developing that cloning technology? But if so, isn't it too late? Because the Emperor's already dead by then.
Well, the thing I had with this, and again, I have a theory, this is based on some stuff I'd read online, which I think is very good, and I like this as a concept, is what Filoni is trying to do in conjunction with this and a variety of the other shows is he's recognized the real value of Star Wars, and the central tenet of Star Wars is the rebellion versus the Empire. And the problem you have is pre-Episode 4, we have no rebellion and no empire. And post-Episode 6, we have no empire and no rebellion. What we do have is remnants of the Empire. We had the idea that, like, the Empire still stood, the original Zahn trilogy. But we now have the sequel movies, which is really the First Order. We've called them the First Order. And so part of the idea behind it is what we're seeing in this is a setup of effectively after Episode 6, after Return of the Jedi and the death of the Emperor, there's two factions on what the Empire is. One faction is the Empire is the Emperor, and one faction is the Empire is order. It is this organization which is a philosophy, and the philosophy is more important than any one person. So the Emperor doesn't matter.
The Emperor, under the Emperor, the Empire is the end, and under the Empire vision, it's the means for achieving order.
That's sort of a good way of putting it. And so is what we're looking at is how do we get the cloning technology for the Emperor, is that he always wanted to do this, so we set it up in Bad Batch. We now have Mandalorian saying, yes, we're going to develop it. That's going to become an aspect of it, is they're going to figure it out so that Episode 9 makes sense. But what we really have in this, because in The Mandalorian we have the First Order sort of showing up a little bit again, is what we're really saying is that batch is trying to fulfill the Emperor's vision of bringing him back because he's, for lack of a better term, a messianic figure. We need him. He's the only way the Empire functions. And that's what it's going to be. On the other side, we have the Empire being more, in some sense, Darth Vader's vision and really Grand Admiral Thrawn's vision. And that's what we see it going with Ahsoka. So the things, and, with Thrawn basically being I am the Empire. We don't need a Sith. Because the Empire is a philosophy more than it is, mystic religion. And it ties in some respects, to Vader's behavior on the original Death Star. When you first meet him. Of, the idea where he's the, this technological,
he's a little dismissive.
Yeah. Has nothing against the power of the Force. And kind of, but we took all the money from Hemlock from the Emperor's cloning project and gave it to Project Stardust, to the Death Star. Oh, this is just one of the Emperor's, harebrained scheme to be, amazing and powerful, which isn't going to work because he thinks I'm too grand of a scale. And
I wonder if maybe it's setting up maybe very subtly setting up, a schism between Vader and the Emperor. Because, because the ultimately is obviously the major plot point, but then they have two different visions, and between that and Luke's influence on his father, Vader's like, all right, none of this is going the way that I needed it to.
And it's the line, we haven't going to talk about it, but there's a line in Tales of the Empire from Grand Admiral Thrawn, where he says part of the problem with the Empire as it's going with this is you have all these people with all these huge, grand, we have the Death Star and these other giant plans and plots that don't work. That's not what the Empire is. So again, that idea of this sort of philosophical disagreement with the Empire, we'll obviously talk about Tales of the Empire later, but quite frankly, that to me, that is probably one of the best scenes in all of recent Star Wars content. And that's, to me, because it ties so much of this together. But anyway, that's what we have. We get to the idea, they obviously escape. sort of in the end. And then, in some sense, we conclude the Bad Batch. Everybody knows this is the last season.
Yeah, the very last scene is Omega at some point in the future. We don't know exactly when, but presumably shortly before episode 4 begins.
She's now basically a teenager.
Grown teenager, and she's running off to join the rebellion. The rest of the Bad Batch is old and pot-bellied now, and they just want to sit around and watch their football.
Yeah, that was sort of awesome, actually. I mean, you really have Hunter doing it, where Hunter's kind of like, yeah, whatever, you can go.
He's like, I have to tell you.
Yeah, follow on.
So, it's a nice way to wind it up, and who knows, maybe we'll find some way that they kind of retcon her back into the other episodes.
Well, and what I really got from this is, again, we closed all these hooks, but we created all these new ones. What the heck is Ventress doing now? Where does Omega go? Omega's got to go join the rebellion. Who is she? Where does she show up? Because she's not in any of the movies. Is she going to show up in Solo's movies? Again, to me, it really felt like what we were doing in Bad Batch was getting rid of some plot holes we didn't want to use and creating some new ones we're going to use in the future. And that was the purpose of season 3. It didn't really have a plot because it wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to set these things up.
Interestingly, Omega doesn't have to be a huge part of the rebellion. It's possible for her to just be a person who joined and wasn't involved in the main action. That's been one of my criticisms of not just Star Wars, but when you have these characters, the temptation to weave them all together.
Yeah.
We talked about the Solo movie. It turns out that everything we happen to learn about Han Solo in the original trilogy, all 9 things we know about what he did before that, all happened in the span of 3 days in the Solo film, which just seems extremely unlikely. It's just, you know how this happens from a writing perspective. Okay, we're going to make a Han Solo prequel film. What do we know about Han? So that we don't, 1, do anything inconsistent with that, and 2, give us some ideas of what to talk about. And so that's what they did. And here, if they truly do just say, okay, Omega grows up, lives with the Bad Batch, for 10 years, and then when she's an adult, runs off and joins the rebellion, but then just never does anything that's featured in the other films, that's perfectly fine. In fact, that makes more sense than, it just happens, guess what, she's secretly Mon Mothma's adopted daughter that we never knew about. That would be dumb, and I'm glad that they're not going that way, and I hope they don't go that way.
I think they are going to go that way.
I think they're probably, the temptation is hard to avoid, but, and likewise the Bad Batch, they just retired them. There's no... they can still they don't have to die. Yeah. And they can just be alive and not involved. That's fine.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I really had from it. And it's the way I heard this. And again, this was some of the stuff I was reading online. I ended up at the end of Bad Batch. I really had to go and access a number of online sources to just sort of go, who were these people again? How did this all fit together?
I was going to ask you that, because as I was watching this, I remember all these characters as they come up. The pirate lady, I think Wanda Sykes does her voice. She's one of my favorites, random characters. And they reintroduced the assassin. I always forget her name, from The Mandalorian. And I remember all these characters, Rampart I remember, but I just felt like there were maybe too many characters, too many plot threads being woven in here. And also, I keep getting lost on the time frame, because I've got my original trilogy, and this is before this quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then we had the Kenobi one, which is probably around the same time based on the timing, because Leia had to be about 6 or 7, maybe 10 in that, somewhere in that range. And then we got the Mandalorian, which is after Jedi. I'm kind of getting lost in my head on which characters are in which time frame, and who knows who and who's done what. And I thought maybe this one, maybe that's why there was so much action, is because there's already too much plottiness and too many characters to deal with. And I'm sure somebody has a contract somewhere. Look, we're going to write 15 episodes, fill the time. So the easiest way to do that without making things even more complicated is have 5 minutes of plot and 45 minutes of action.
Yeah, and that's, again, what my thing with it is, what's said in the review online, and I liked what somebody commented about, is they said, one of the things they really liked about Omega is you get this M count, you get the fact that somehow she's associated with the Jedi. My take is that she's necessary to give clones the ability to have the Force.
Yeah.
And, we know she's different. I mean, my take has always been, how do you clone a younger girl in conjunction with, what's essentially 5 older men?
Yeah, clone army full of men. Yeah.
And how does that work as a clone? And Emery's the same problem. She's a younger woman, yet you have now Emery's a grown woman. So how do we have these few women clones that are sort of showing up? And the idea that maybe cloning isn't really directly cloning. There's some uniqueness amongst them. The Bad Batch is sort of infused with that. That's something that's going to come back later. But one of the comments with it is they said, and I love this, and I very much believe it, one of the faults you bump into in all of the Star Wars universe is you have too dang many Jedi characters.
Yeah.
Jedi are very, very rare. The problem with it is because they're interesting and they're such an important aspect of the universe.
It's hard not to
have them be the central part of the story. And so in Bad Batch, where we have a story that has no Jedi in it, we kind of feel the need to put Jedi in it. In a story like Andor, where we have no Jedi in it, we kind of feel the need to put Jedi in it. And that
it doesn't really belong.
and that was the comment with, it was very nice to have Omega have this sort of, you kind of are Jedi, there are Jedi here, they're kind of on the side, they're, these children. But none of that matters. Not a single one of them ever uses a Force ability to any effect whatsoever.
What's the overall narrative here? We have, for the whole Bad Batch series, if you were to say thematically, what is it about? To me, it's basically a lens for viewing the empirification of the Empire, like it truly becoming the Empire, like you said. But in terms of these characters, Omega kind of grows up, becomes independent, and joins the rebellion. But other than that, it's a very light coming of age story, sort of.
And what I keep wondering about as well is, keep in mind, we know from the first episode of the Bad Batch, because it's now been made clear, the apprentice that escapes in the beginning of the Bad Batch is Ezra from Star Wars
is it
Rebels.
Ezra, or is it his mentor?
Oh, no, sorry, it's his mentor, not Ezra, it's the mentor.
Catan, is that his name?
Yeah, it's escaping me.
I'll look it up.
But yeah, so we have, already this connection there. Is that what we're now going to see? You're seeing so much of these Easter eggs, these interconnections between the shows. It's now hard to not think something is supposed to be an interconnection between the shows. And so is that the idea of her leaving to join, the rebellion actually means she's in Rebels? Maybe she already is and we just don't connect it.
Kanan, that was his
Kanan,
name.
that's it, yeah. And so, Kanan's the apprentice that escapes.
Played by Freddie Prinze Jr.
Yeah. And so you have this kind of like, okay, how much of this is who's who? How does this all fit together? And it's starting to feel like too big of a plot. You know,
there's too many moving pieces, maybe. And I guess it kind of makes sense. There's a lot of story to tell. I like the idea that they try to weave in that you've got these clones who are now all superfluous. And the Empire has to figure out what to do with them. You basically have a standing army of people. And there was an opportunity here maybe for some social commentary that they perhaps smartly avoided. But the situation's similar. It's like post-World War II. You have all these soldiers coming back who all got either drafted or signed up the minute they turned 18 to go fight. They come back home. They have no other skills. All they know is war and fighting. You got to find something to do with them. And so you have the same situation with the clones. What do you do? And the Empire didn't really seem to have an answer other than to find some way to fit them into the army, but then they all got treated terribly.
And then things like massive discrimination and
so sort of a post-Vietnam type thing there a little bit, but they really were not very heavy-handed with it. It was really focused on Crosshair. So there was some narrative elements there that could have gone somewhere, but again, they hit it and then walked away from it.
Yeah, and the thing that I think they did that was good with it is to me, again, the purpose of this show was to show the heavy-handedness of the Empire. And again, I like the empirification of the Star Wars universe. That, when you talk about what's in the prequels, we're in a universe which has a level of freedom sort of never seen again. Mm-hmm. Even in the later, the last three movies, the sequel movies, you still don't have that level returning. You can't get rid of the shadow of the Empire. Just how much it influences everything. I also, and again, I sort of follow that idea. I think what we're seeing with this, and I think we're going to start seeing more of this, quite frankly, in these shows, is this concept of what is the next trilogy of movies. And I throw that out just generally as, what it is. I'm not sure there's going to be another trilogy of movies.
We know they're making another Rey movie. Yeah. I don't know if it's a 1 or 3.
I think I've heard it's a 1.
Is it? Okay.
But the thing about it is, and what I've sort of looked with it is, we know that there needs to be a Star Wars for lack of a better term, Generation Z. Knowing that we have the prequel, there's those with the original trilogy, those with the prequels, those with the sequels. We need a Star Wars for the next generation. And I think that a lot of this setup is to get onto a linear timeline, which can then progress in a very linear fashion.
Yeah.
Because what right now we're doing is we're cleaning up all the messiness around this, and we now have a format to do it. You don't have to have read all the novels. We can now say Disney controls this in its entirety. We're going to try to encapsulate, this is what happens in the Skywalker saga, for lack of a better way of putting it, because I like that that phrase. You know, all of this is encapsulated into it. All these characters are interrelated. All this thing has it. And in the end, this is the group of characters that leave. And you need to know all of this to get to those. But here's the 5 or 6 characters that leave. And now it's their story. Mm-hmm. And that's the new story. And as part of it, they're going to create a whole new cast of characters. Then they're going to leave. And I think we're going to see that happening much more in TV generally. I think it's what's happening in the MCU.
Yep.
You know, quite frankly, I think it's what we're going to see in Star Wars. Any of these big, major, valuable properties, I think we're going to see this idea that periodically we have to kind of close the loop and have the people escape and then have them recreate a new loop.
So I want to leave us, because I know Kirk and I both have to jump here. We both have obligations coming up in a few minutes. I want to leave with a parting thought that's going to make all of our listeners hate us and feel very old. Kirk, you just said, the Star Wars movies for the next generation. The sequels were for the last generation. I don't know if you realize how apt of an observation that is. Do you recall when Episode 7 came out? What year?
Episode 7. It's like the 20th anniversary. So, no, sorry, that's the... I'm trying to think as to what it is. So, we've got the prequels in the late 90s.
I think 99 was Episode 1.
Yeah, so we've got to have, my guess is 2011, 2012?
2015 was The Force Awakens, which I was further back than I thought. Going on almost 10 years now since that sequel trilogy launched. And in my mind, it happened a couple years ago still. Those movies just came out not that long ago. But no, 2015. So those of you who didn't already hate us, you hate us now for reminding you how long ago that was. Yep. I'm surprised, though, you went even further back. I would have thought you would have said, 2019, right before the pandemic.
No, I was trying to, it was right before the pandemic. It was pre-pandemic, so everything but pre-pandemic was right before the pandemic. But no, it's the only reason I know it is because I very specifically remember where I was for Episode 1. And so it was I could work through Episode 1, and then I'm like, but I kept thinking Episode 3 was like late 90s, but it would have gotten into the 2000s. Yeah. And then, maybe 10 years later or that kind of thing. Because I know it was an anniversary. I know we just had like the 25th anniversary of Episode 1. So yeah, I guess that is the 25th anniversary is 99 with the re-release in theaters. But yeah, and it's even the prequels feel new. Maybe this is just all of, us getting old and things like that. Star Wars is, 50 years old.
I know, it's hard to believe. I was reading the Star Wars subreddit, and there's all these millennials on there talking about how the 25th anniversary of Episode 1 and how they remember seeing it in the theater when they were, 8 years old, and they're all in their 30s now. Yeah, I'm just like, I don't need to read this.
Yeah, exactly.
Things I don't need to know.
But I do think I think we're seeing a setup for Star Wars for the next generation, and quite frankly, it's good.
Yeah.
I mean, they need to find a path to advance this plot line in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd really like to see them kind of leave the present generation behind. We talked about this with Star Trek. Next gen, they moved far enough ahead that you can kind of ignore the first set of, kind of a soft reboot. Star Wars kind of needs that. They sort of did that with the sequels, but then they brought all the same characters back. They need to move it ahead like 126 years so that all these people are gone, all their kids are gone, all their grandkids are gone, and we can just have a new, fresh story in this universe.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
All right, that's all for this time. We'll see you next time. Or play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.